So, due to all these factors coming together, the United States will advance, industrialize, and outperform the rest of the world. And a big reason for that was because at this time, we get the beginning of what's called big business or corporations. We had manufacturing and industry in the United States before this period, but it was always small scale. The owner of the manufacturing company would work in the shop, usually side by side with his workers, or he'd be overseeing them, but he would be there, and they were small scale manufacturing. This is the beginning of modern day corporations that have large scale management bureaucracies and thousands of employees. Some of these corporations, the size of them was comparable to the entire governments of European countries. And what I mean by large scale management bureaucracies, you have the owner at the very top, like the John D. Rockefeller, the Carnegie, and then they would have like vice presidents, and then you would have regional managers, then they would oversee other managers who would oversee heads of department, who would oversee thousands and thousands of workers. And obviously, the owners, they didn't know any of their workers. So it's a very impersonal system. But these massive corporations will grow, and we had never seen these in U.S. history. So they had no regulations, they had nothing restricting them whatsoever because they were brand new. And these expanded so much and they got so much power that they are the ones that will really have control of politics during this period. And really importantly, the very first big business, the very first corporation were the railroads. Railroads were the very first industry to create this huge bureaucratic administrative system, and they will be the blueprint for what other companies will use, like John D. Rockefeller and Carnegie, when they create their corporations. This number is important and it's very telling. By 1896, the railroad industry was about 15% of the entire country's GNP, or gross national product. That means 15% of all economic activity is the railroads. At the time, that was more than the federal government, all state governments, and all local governments' economies combined. So that just tells you how big and how much power these things had. There are three really important things to know about corporations, and always remember this. First and foremost, corporations are not good or bad inherently. And it's one of those political things that you're asking conservative corporations could do no wrong, and someone that's really liberal, then they can do no right. And the fact is, if the United States is going to be a world economic superpower, which we want it to be, you need to have corporations. You cannot be a world power without them. But they definitely are not inherently good. So they're not good or bad. It's just like government. It's not good or bad. What is it doing? What is specific act, specific policy? And in both cases, you can find aspects that are good and aspects that are bad. So that's the first point. They're not good or bad. Second point, it's really important to remember, they are motivated by one thing and one thing only, and that is money. And that is the way it's supposed to be. That's not a criticism of them at all. They have a fiduciary responsibility. They have a legal responsibility to pursue wealth and be motivated by money. There's this weird view that they are somehow moral actors. and should be behaving, should be acting morally, and their motivation, and this is important to always remember, is money. So will they look out for the interest of everyday people? If it suits their economic interest, yes. If it doesn't, no. It's the second major thing that people forget quite a lot, is that is their job, is to make money. The third point to remember about corporations during the Gilded Age is they had the power. So it's not always true. There have been periods where the federal government has put on a lot of regulations, but at this time they were so big and they had so much money, and because we had never seen them, they had no regulation, so they had all the power, and they will have the most control of what the federal government does during this period. The first big business, the first corporation, and one that is so important to know about, are the railroads. So the United States built its first transcontinental railroad in 1869, and very soon after that, 4 more were built, and then the railroad system, by 1890, it's just connecting almost everywhere in the country. Almost everywhere in the country, you have access to or people had access to railroads. And that is absolutely fundamental, because you cannot become an industrial or economic superpower without a transportation system. And remember, there's not a road system yet. You need to have a railroad system because, it creates a national market. So people in rural areas that are like farmers, they need to be able to sell their goods to the cities, like food, so people in the city can eat, but also just the raw materials. So if you're a factory that makes steel, you have to get that iron to you to make the steel somehow, and so you need railroads. If you're textile, it's where you take cotton to make shirts or something like that. You need to have a railroad so you can get the cotton from the fields to the manufacturing plant. So railroads allow raw materials to get to the cities, to the factories, and then they also make it so the factories can send their goods all throughout the country to be bought. So if you look at the map, if you lived, somewhere like Idaho in 1870, you didn't have access to a lot of to stuff from cities, except by wagon or something terrible like that. But so if you lived in most of the country that's rural and didn't have access to a railroad, you're sleeping on a mattress made of hay, which is insanely uncomfortable. But all of a sudden, a railroad comes close to where you live, and now you have access to manufactured goods, and so it's good for manufacturing companies as well. So now there is a national economy, and it's interconnected, and so goods can be exchanged more freely, which is absolutely essential for any of this. None of this could have happened without the railroad. Railroads also take a lot to build, and so they really bolstered all sorts of other industries, like steel especially, but not just steel, like wood, timber. You need all sorts of stuff, including labor, to build those railroads. And so it stimulated the economy overall. So this is absolutely essential for everything else that happens. And as you remember from the previous lectures, railroads are the reason for the New South, and also, ironically, the reason that the cattle trails ended and the Old West, like in Texas, came to an end. This is the same thing, this is something that Alexander Hamilton had called for in his report on manufactures, and Henry Clay had called for in his American system. So we had known for almost a century that a transportation system would make the entire U.S. economy do well. It's fun too. Those two, they had been talking about roads. Like obviously in Hamilton's time, railroads weren't even a thing, but they were talking about creating a national roads, federal government creating a national road system, and we won't get that until 1956, Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidency with the Interstate Highway Act. So that is still, a good 60 to 70 years in the future. But it turns out this will be absolutely phenomenal for the economy. And in that 35-year period, from about 1865 to 1900, the amount of rail line in the United States, it will go up by more than 560%. So it just explodes. And it is the stimulus for all of the other, for everything else that happens. So railroads, the first major corporation, they are the first industry that will have unions and have major strikes, which we'll talk about next week. And they will also be the first industry to be regulated, because there was so much corruption and so much fraud and crime that came along with the railroads. And a big reason for that was because railroads aren't a quick return on investment. So it requires a company to build them, and then it takes years and years and years to earn enough money to make it worthwhile. Now, obviously, everywhere in the country wants a rail line. Every city and every state wants railroads. And it's good for the federal government, for the entire economy. So since they promise little return on investment, the national government and state governments would give them huge amounts of subsidies. Subsidies, it's government assistance. The federal government will give massive subsidies to the railroad companies, and it is enormous. By 1900, the federal government had given $707 million in just cash. Just given $770 million in cash to the railroad companies, and more than $300 million in land. So railroad companies have gotten about $1 billion in government assistance. And remember, this is the period of laissez-faire. Everyone's for themselves, dog-eat-dog world. The government doesn't help anyone, except, of course, business. Because, as I mentioned before, it was becoming an oligarchy. All these huge corporations, Standard Oil, U.S. Steel under Carnegie, and these railroad companies, they controlled Congress. They controlled the legislature. And so they were getting laws passed to give themselves economic assistance. Now, there was no economic assistance for anyone else, but just them. That is what an oligarchy is when the political institutions start being controlled by a small group of really wealthy elites, and then they change the laws to benefit them economically, which was not good for the majority of the population. Now, it's good to have railroads, but we'll come back to why this is all a problem a little later. So the federal government and state governments are just showering railroad companies with assistance. And that is where we get some of the biggest corruption, because like some congressmen and some senators would be working for the railroad company. At the same time, they are getting laws passed in Congress to give the railroad companies even more benefit. And there's like the most famous case is called Credit Mobilier case, construction company case, and it was a huge scandal. The congressman got other members of Congress to have huge subsidies, and in exchange, he gave them shares in the railroad company. And so the railroad company then charged just absurd rates for all the construction and all the parts, and it's called Mobilier Construction because they basically made up a fake construction company to charge even more. It was a huge scandal and wasn't the last, but it was one of the most notorious of the entire period, and of course it was from the railroads. Take a look at this map. It's kind of interesting. You know, you go west of the Mississippi River and there is federal subsidies to every state except Texas and Oklahoma, but don't worry about Oklahoma. Why are there no federal subsidies to Texas? It's because Texas is the only state in the Union that when it joined, it got to keep all of its own land. When Texas joined the Union, it joined with the stipulation that it would keep all of its debt, it was $10 million at the time, and it would also get to keep all of its land. It's the only state in the Union that gets to keep its land. And also, now Texas as a geographic area has the most oil of any geographic area of that size in the world. That's why Texas has been able to keep its tax rate so low, is because it is literally sitting on black gold, and quite a lot of it. So the federal government had no legal right to give away land in Texas. But Texas, the state, gave away like 32 million acres to railroads. So it did give a lot of subsidies on its own. Another really important industry that created some of the first large corporations, and one of the most innovative in creating these new corporations was the oil industry. The very first oil strike was in Pennsylvania, and this is the period when oil becomes the world's most important natural resource. If you remember from the first half of this class, the most important natural resource in the world for a while was tobacco, and then for a while it was cotton from the United States South. The Civil War ended cotton from the U.S. South being the most important, and this is when oil starts becoming the most important natural resource in the world, which it has been now for about 100 years. And that is slowly coming to an end, but it's obviously absolutely instrumental, and it will be for quite a while still. The person that is always associated with the oil industry is John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller is so fascinating. He was born in New York, really poor, like Carnegie, and his family moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and then his father abandoned the family, and Rockefeller will get into the oil industry, and he'll start with one oil refinery in 1963, and then by 1863, and by 1890, by 1880, he created Standard Oil of Ohio, and by 1890, he will control 90 to 95% of all oil refineries in the United States. And the only ones he didn't control is ones that he saw no use in taking over. He is, to this day, he's the richest American we've ever had. And he was the richest man in the world. He is America's first billionaire too. Rockefeller was incredibly innovative, and he was just a good businessman. He had a lot of business smarts in terms of organization, research and development, hiring the best people around him. And so he had very good business practices, but he also did things that are unethical, immoral, and today just flat out illegal. the way he would take over other companies is by any way he possibly could. And a lot of times he did it by completely illegal means. Also, he was notorious for buying off politicians and getting laws changed to benefit his company to the detriment of a big part of the population. So to say Buddy was an absolutely phenomenal businessman. All these people that I've mentioned, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, Edison, there is a debate, and it's really a dumb debate, about whether to call them industrial statesmen or robber barons. And they're sometimes called robber barons because robber barons were in medieval Europe when a baron would own a lot of land and they would force people to pay them to use their land or even travel through it or something. It was a form of government stealing. And industrial statesman implies that they were good businessmen, and the fact is they were just both. To say that they were one or the other, people are usually giving away their political ideology. So the really important thing to understand, though, is that during this period, we didn't have any laws against a lot of the things they were doing. And a lot of things they were doing, everyone will agree that, I'll say some of the things that they were doing were just unethical. And there's no one that can disagree with that when you get into the specific practices they had to push competition out or to take over competition. So they are considered both. This is also one of the reasons that currently this period that we are living in is sometimes referred to as the second Gilded Age, because now we are going through another economic and technological revolution from manufacturing to a knowledge-based economy. And we have new robber barons, the Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, who are only able to do what they did, or create these companies because there's zero regulations on them. Internet is relatively new in human history, and we have not created a legal system that deals with some of the problems from them. So that is a big reason that the Gilded Age of the late 1800s and is comparable to today is we have new kinds of industrial statesmen or robber barons.